2014年以学生为主导的民主抗议活动以来，香港历经了前所未有的自由镇压。学生抗议者遭监禁，政治候选人被取消参选竞选资格，立法者不得进入立法机关。无论是新闻自由、学术自由或法治，都面临着习近平专制统治日益限制自由的气氛。香港建制派组织公民力量于2018年11月1号在华盛顿举办了一场论坛，题目为“收紧控制：香港自由的消蚀和权威的崛起”。演讲人是英国香港观察的联合创始人兼主席本尼迪克·罗杰斯，主持人为公民力量的发起人杨建利。香港观察是2017年成立的倡导组织，专门为香港的自由与法治发声，监督香港的人权状况。2017年10月11号，由于中国政府的一项命令，导致本尼迪克在抵达香港后却遭拒绝入境，这件事情引发国际媒体的密切关注。以下就是这场论坛的现场画面，现在就带各位来看看。
I want to extend a warm welcome to you all to the Citizen Power Forum in our brand new office. It is indeed brand new, you can smell it. And technically, we moved in this morning. So we are particularly honored to host a housewarming event with a wonderful speaker and a dear friend, Mr. Benedict Rogers. I just cannot get a better housewarming gift. Thank you for coming to speak. And I will not speak too much, introduce Ben. I think most of you have already read about him many times. If not, you will get to know in a matter of a minute what he is and what he does as he speaks. But I just want to say Ben is one of the world's most committed champions for human rights and democracy in China, especially in Hong Kong. Very importantly, I would love to introduce him as someone pro-China, a panda hugger, if you will, because he has best defined these terms through his words and deeds. With no further ado, let's welcome our guest speaker, Benedict Rogers.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I say, first of all, what a really great joy and privilege it is to be here on your first day in this wonderful and very impressive new office, and it's fantastic that you are located so close to the Congress on Capitol Hill, and I wish you the very best in all your work, strengthening the voice for human rights in China, including Hong Kong. I have a yellow umbrella here, but if I cannot carry a yellow umbrella, I at least try to wear a yellow tie in solidarity with the umbrella movement and everything that represents. And the third thing I want to say by way of introduction is if there are any journalists from Chinese state media, you are very welcome, but please try not to hit anybody this time. I will say more about that later if anyone is not familiar with what I'm referring to. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, I have three affiliations that are relevant here. My full-time work, I work for a human rights organization called CSW, which particularly focuses on freedom of religion around the world, and we do a lot of work on China. In my spare time, I'm the Deputy Chair of the United Kingdom's Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which 2 years ago published a major report after we carried out a big inquiry on human rights in China, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I'm here tonight on behalf of Hong Kong Watch, which is an organization that I helped to found less than a year ago to speak up for freedom, the rule of law and autonomy in Hong Kong. If we could go to the next slide, please. I did prepare a text which I think will be made available to you both in English and in Chinese, but rather than speak from that text, which you can read for yourselves later, I would speak more freely and accompanied by some visual images. Just to give you a little bit of background to my involvement with China before I talk about Hong Kong, I first went to China when I was 18 years old in 1992, in my year between high school and university. And I went to teach English in Qingdao on the east coast of China. And I really fell in love with China. I made many Chinese friends. I became fascinated by China. I went back several times in my summer vacations as a student. And then I went on to do a master's in China studies. And when I finished my master's, I then moved to Hong Kong in 1997, September 1997, just a few months after the handover. And I lived there for the first 5 years of Chinese rule in Hong Kong. If we go to the next slide, over the years, I've traveled around different parts of China. I've even slept on the Great Wall of China under the stars. And I have been many times into China. If we go to the next slide, I mentioned a few moments ago that in 2016 the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission held an inquiry on human rights in China, including Hong Kong. We had 3 hearings in the British Parliament. We heard from, for example, if we go to the next slide, we heard from the former Miss World Canada, Anastasia Lin, who spoke at one of our hearings and actually spoke at the launch of the report. And if we go to the next slide, this is her in one of the hearings. We've held other hearings on China as well. And that report is available on the Commission's website, which is conservativehumanrights.com. Over the years after 2014, I got more and more involved. I started to write about what was happening in Hong Kong. I hosted on various occasions visits to London for Nathan Law, Joshua Wong, and indeed Anson Chan herself. And it was last summer, in August, that I was sitting in a traffic jam in Surabaya in Indonesia. If anybody knows Indonesian traffic, you'll know that a traffic jam in Surabaya gives you a lot of time to think. And I was sitting in this traffic jam thinking about Joshua, Nathan, and Alex Chow, who were on trial at that time. And I was following their case, and I was deeply concerned about their case, and I knew all 3 of them personally by this point. And I thought to myself, there is a real need for an organization that will speak out for Hong Kong. It's one thing to have an individual on an ad hoc basis, occasionally arranging visits for people and occasionally writing articles. But I think that there is a need now for a sustainable organization to advocate for, not for the imposition of anything new for Hong Kong, but for the honoring of the promises that were made to the people of Hong Kong before the handover. When Joshua, Nathan, and Alex were jailed, I was actually taking a few days vacation in Bali at the end of a work trip to Indonesia. But of course I was watching the verdict of their trial, and when I saw the verdict and saw their sentence, I thought to myself, walking along the beach in Bali, somebody should do something. Somebody should speak out. Somebody should organize a letter to say that the sentence that they have received is a terrible travesty of justice. And then I suddenly realized that maybe that somebody was me, and so I came back from the beach and started to work on that and helped to organize various statements, and go to the next slide, articles in the international press. And the next slide, the first statement was a statement by 25 international figures from around the world, and then also a number of lawyers from Britain, senior lawyers, came together to write that statement. If we go to the next slide, we then started to organize demonstrations in London with our yellow umbrellas. And the next slide. And that, up until October last year, that was the extent of my advocacy for Hong Kong. Some letters, some statements, some articles, some protests. But then I thought it would be important to go back to Hong Kong in order to listen to what do they want the international community to do. I was not intending to go to Hong Kong to make speeches or make public appearances or anything like that. I was going to meet a few old friends and a few new friends for tea or coffee or dim sum and to listen to them. And a few days before I was due to go to Hong Kong, I was elsewhere in the region, and I received a telephone call from a British Member of Parliament, who is someone that I know personally and who is a friend. And he called me to tell me that the Chinese embassy in London had contacted him to say they knew that I was intending to go to Hong Kong, and they wanted him to put pressure on me not to go. And he said, I want to make it clear, I'm not telling you not to go, I'm just passing the message on to you and letting you know that there may be a problem. So I consulted very widely on what to do, and unanimously everyone I spoke to in Hong Kong and senior people in the UK said to me, you must still go, because they thought that the likelihood was that this was just a threat, and that Hong Kong's autonomy was still such that it had control of its immigration policy, and that it would be up to Hong Kong immigration to let me in, and that if it was in the hands of Hong Kong immigration, I would have no problem getting in. But they said if, in the unlikely event, they thought that Beijing was serious, then the world needs to know, because this is yet another example of flagrant violation of Hong Kong's autonomy. So for those two reasons, I went ahead and I arrived in Hong Kong, and it turned out that they were serious. And you can find out the rest of that story if you just Google, if you don't already know it. But I was refused entry in October last year. It generated if we go to the next slide, thank you. It generated quite a lot of attention, and I want to make it clear. First of all, I would have preferred to have gone into Hong Kong quietly and met the people I wanted to meet and come back. But given that it happened, I was pleased that it generated attention, not for me, but for Hong Kong. And what I hoped to do was to use the spotlight that incident arose to try and shine the spotlight on what really matters, which is what's happening for the people of Hong Kong. But so I was pleased that the British Foreign Secretary at the time issued a very strong statement, summoned the Chinese ambassador, and it was, if we go to the next slide, it was raised several times on the floor of Parliament. If we could go to the next one and the one after, please. It was raised in Parliament. It was raised, if we go to the next slide, Congressman Chris Smith made a very strong statement on behalf of the CECC. And then what was most surprising to me was the reaction in Hong Kong itself, where a legislator in the Legislative Assembly staged a protest. He was somebody I had met in London a few weeks previously, and when we met, we took a photograph together. I did not expect that photograph to then be turned into a placard. I've waved many placards myself over the years with other people's faces on them. I didn't expect to be the subject of a placard. But if we go to the next slide and on to the next one, there were a series of voices in Hong Kong raised about this. And again, it wasn't about me, it was about the principle at stake of a foreigner being denied entry on the orders of Beijing, which is a blatant violation of Hong Kong's autonomy. And so after all of this, if we go to the next slide, I came together with a number of others to launch Hong Kong Watch, to be a voice for freedom, human rights, the rule of law and autonomy in Hong Kong. And this was a response to the build-up of violations in Hong Kong over a number of years. I've talked so far about my own very small personal experience. What I've experienced is nothing compared to what the people of Hong Kong are experiencing. As many of you will know, we've seen booksellers abducted, we've seen peaceful protesters jailed, with jail sentences ranging from several months to, in at least one case, the case of Edward Leung, 6 years. Again, you could argue that compared to what happens in mainland China, those sentences are much smaller, and prison conditions in Hong Kong are much better than if this was in the mainland. But nevertheless, the principle at stake, that these young people are being jailed for peaceful protest, even if they only have a few weeks in prison, they have a criminal record, their prospects for their careers are seriously undermined, and it's deeply troubling. We've seen threats to press freedom, most recently the expulsion of the Financial Times Asia news editor Victor Mallet, which I think is a profoundly serious undermining of freedom of expression and press freedom in Hong Kong. We've seen threats to academic freedom and other basic freedoms. The former governor, Chris Patten, has been speaking out, but when I spoke to him about the possibility of starting Hong Kong Watch, he was extremely supportive, and he said one of the reasons he was so happy that we were starting this was that until that point he had been a relatively lone voice in the UK, and he did not want this to be seen as a pattern agenda. He wanted this to be seen as a concern particularly for the United Kingdom, given the Sino-British joint declaration that is lodged at the United Nations, but actually an issue for the international community. And that's why I'm here in Washington, D.C. At the moment. We've built up awareness, and we still have more to do in the United Kingdom. We've been working in the European Union, in Germany. I was just in Ottawa before coming here, because we believe this is of concern for the international community. Just to say a little bit more, if we go to the next slide, Hong Kong Watch has 5 patrons from across the political spectrum. We launched it in Speaker's House in Parliament, and we could perhaps just go through the following images. If you keep going, just it gives you an idea of some of our activities. And then I just want to say a couple of other things before I conclude. Last year, and since starting Hong Kong Watch, I've had another very interesting experience, which again is insignificant compared to what people in mainland China and people in Hong Kong go through. It really doesn't matter on a personal level, but I think it matters in the sense of an indication of how China is behaving even well beyond its borders. Over the last year, I've been the recipient of 5 anonymous letters from Hong Kong, postmarked and stamped from Hong Kong. The first one was this one that came with my picture and the words, "Watch him," which was sent to all my neighbours in the street that I live in London, my home address and my neighbour's address. The letter said that I claimed to be a human rights activist, but it was addressed to Dear Resident. So to all my neighbours it said that Ben Rogers claims to be a human rights activist. In reality, he's an agent of British intelligence. I wish I was, because then I could do something. And asking my neighbours to keep an eye on me. Rather strangely, it also said, keep an eye on him, find out what he's doing, maybe buy him a cold beer. Well, one of my neighbours invited me to have a cold beer. He said, I want to meet you and find out more about what you're doing. And several of my neighbours actually expressed support for this work, people who were not previously involved or aware. So actually the letters backfired and helped raise awareness in my street about Hong Kong. But I've had 3 of these letters to my neighbours. I've had 1 letter sent to my mother in a different part of the country telling her to ask her son to stop speaking about China and Hong Kong. She took the view that she'd long ago given up trying to tell me what to do, and she was very relaxed about it. But And the final letter went to my employers at CSW. Generally, you know better than me whether this is correct, but what one mainland Chinese friend said to me is that this tactic is very common in the mainland of trying to put pressure on activists through their neighbours, through their family, and through their employers. But the idea that this would work in London is quite bizarre. And then, if we go to the next slide, just very recently we had another experience of China's behaviour beyond its borders. We held an event at the United Kingdom's Conservative Party conference, roughly similar to your conventions in the United States, except we do it once a year and on a much, much smaller scale, but it's the annual conference of the party. And Hong Kong Watch and the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission held a joint event where we had Martin Lee, Benny Tai, and Nathan Law speak, and I spoke alongside them. And it was chaired by the chair of the commission, Fiona Bruce, a member of Parliament. We had about 80 people in the room, and everything went very smoothly. Our three speakers from Hong Kong spoke very well. I spoke, we took questions. And then right at the very end of the event, just as we were finishing, Fiona Bruce MP asked me to make some penultimate concluding remarks before giving the final word to Martin Lee. So I made a couple of comments in response to some questions, and then I said something very deliberately, which I feel quite strongly about. I could see in the room there were Chinese people who I guessed some of them were from the embassy. And so I said, I want to emphasize that I am pro-China. I am not anti-China in the sense of being pro the people and the country of China. Of course, I'm critical of the regime and the Chinese Communist Party, but I want China as a country to succeed. As I've described in this presentation, I've spent much of my adult life in and around China. I want China to succeed, but I believe it's in China's interests for Hong Kong to succeed, and for that to happen, China must honour the promises that were made to the people of Hong Kong. At that point, to my surprise, a Chinese woman in the second row started screaming at me, not heckling, not arguing, not asking a question, not expressing an opinion, but screaming. And she was screaming, you're a liar, you're anti-China, you want to separate China. And she went on, repeating this. And then she directed her abuse at our three Hong Kong speakers, saying they were traitors and puppets. So after a few minutes, we kind of let her rant for a few moments. But then Fiona Bruce MP said to her quite reasonably, "Okay, madam, you've had your say. Will you please resume your seat so that we can now hear from Martin Lee?" And she wouldn't. And Fiona Bruce appealed to her a second time to stop and to sit down, and she wouldn't. So one of our volunteers, and I'm explaining this to you because some of you may have seen the video of what happened next, but the video doesn't capture the whole story. One of our volunteers approached her very politely and calmly and said, "Madam, you've been asked to take your seat. If you're not going to take your seat, we ask you to leave." And she slapped him. Then somebody else from the audience came round to assist, again perfectly, properly and calmly, but she slapped our volunteer, who was from Hong Kong, a second time. Only then did someone start videoing it. Nobody was videoing it before because we weren't expecting anyone to get slapped. You can see the rest of what happened in the video. If you haven't seen it, if you just Google China Conservative Party, it all comes up. But she was then taken away by security and arrested by the police. What then happened, I'm told, is that 8 Chinese diplomats came to the police station demanding her release. The police, to their credit, said no, she's not a diplomat, she doesn't have diplomatic immunity, so we will handle this according to British law. She was detained for just under 24 hours, and then she was released, which is the norm in our system. But that didn't mean that she was released without charge. The Chinese embassy then put out a statement saying she had been released without charge due to stern representations by the embassy, and that we, the organizers of the event, were the ones who should apologize because it was our fault because we shouldn't have been talking about Hong Kong in our own party conference. And they also said that her arrest was a violation of her freedom of expression. So seemingly in their mindset, she has the freedom of expression to slap people, but we don't have the freedom of expression to discuss Hong Kong. Anyway, she was subsequently charged, and I won't say more on this because she's now facing legal proceedings, and we'll have to see what happens. Except to say that another statement recently was that from the Chinese authorities that they hoped that the trial would be based on the evidence and would be fair and would not be subject to any political interference. A fairly ironic statement to come from the People's Republic of China. And if an incident like this had happened in China, you can guess how they would be treated by the judicial system there. Let me go to the just a couple of final thoughts. We are determined in Hong Kong Watch to continue speaking out. We're still less than a year old, but we believe that not only does Britain and the international community have a moral responsibility, and in the case of Britain at least a legal responsibility under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, to speak up for the promises that were made to the people of Hong Kong, for proper autonomy, basic freedoms, and the rule of law to be honoured. But I also believe it's in our own interest to do so as well. Hong Kong is a major, I think the third major financial centre in the world. It cannot be in the interests of those who might not particularly be vocal on human rights, but who care about business and trade. It can't be in the interest of business and trade to see freedoms and the rule of law and Hong Kong's autonomy being eroded. But also it raises fundamental questions about China's ability or willingness to honour promises that it makes under international agreements. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a legal treaty lodged at the United Nations. China has blatantly and flagrantly violated and broken its promises to that agreement. So how can we trust them to honour their promises under other agreements? If we go to my final slide, ever since 2014, whenever I see umbrellas, somehow there's a spirit of the umbrella that is in me. And these are images from other parts of the world, from Seoul and from Indonesia. But I had to take those photographs and I shared them with friends in Hong Kong to say that even if the umbrella movement in Hong Kong was over and was not perhaps in the short term successful, the spirit of the umbrella movement lives on around the world, and I think it's our responsibility to keep that spirit alive, to keep speaking up for Hong Kong, and to defend Hong Kong against this growing authoritarianism and the broken promises, and to protect Hong Kong's basic freedoms. So thank you very much.
本尼迪克·罗杰斯是英国人权倡导者、保守党人权委员会副主席、香港观察创办人。他在华盛顿发表演讲时，对于当今香港人权状况相当担忧。例如，多名香港书商因为政治缘故被中共政府跨境绑架，香港雨伞运动的参与者被逮捕判刑，英国《金融时报》编辑马凯在香港的工作签证也无法顺利续期。这些新闻事件再再地体现出中共有意摧毁一国两制原则，干预属于香港的自治权。接下来是明镜华盛顿特约记者安华的专访。
Mr. Rogers, I'm from Mirror Group in New York, and today it's my pleasure to have this interview. First of all, can I ask you, how do you judge the overall human rights situation in Hong Kong?
I think the human rights situation in Hong Kong has deteriorated very significantly in the last few years. I lived in Hong Kong from 1997 until 2002, And when I left in 2002, I could genuinely say at that time that one country, two systems was really working pretty well. Maybe there were small problems here and there, but basically Hong Kong's way of life, basic freedoms, the rule of law were intact. But I think in the last few years, we've seen booksellers disappear. We've seen people being jailed for peaceful protest. We've seen legislators and candidates disqualified. I myself was refused entry into Hong Kong.
Oh, really?
Yes, one year ago. And just recently we've seen the case of the Financial Times Asia news editor Victor Mallet being expelled from Hong Kong. So I think all of those examples and many others indicate that there's a serious deterioration in respect for human rights and basic freedoms in Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. How do you, feel about the Carrie Lam took office as the HKSAR's the governor? So after her taking office, how do you think that's the trend? I mean, in Hong Kong about the civil rights and the human rights and and so on.
I think the trend started before Carrie Lam. It started really under C.Y. Leung particularly, but Carrie Lam certainly has not, at least publicly, does not appear to have done anything to defend Hong Kong's freedoms, and indeed the trend has continued under her leadership. So I don't want to criticize her personally, but because I think most of it is coming from Beijing, and it's a reflection of Xi Jinping's rule. I think Carrie Lam has become simply a mouthpiece for Beijing, but certainly the situation under her leadership has not improved. It's declined. It's continued to decline.
Mm-hmm. Do you think she's a puppet of Beijing?
I think by her failure to stand up for basic freedoms in Hong Kong, one can say that. Yes.
What aspect do you think this? Worst. I mean, the most deteriorated is becoming in Hong Kong society.
I think it's difficult to pick out one single issue because it's across the board. I mean, now we see concerns with press freedom, particularly with the issues regarding the Foreign Correspondents Club and Victor Mallet, the Financial Times Asia news editor. But if I had to single out one area, I think it is in terms of the very draconian penalties placed on those who've been involved in what might be described as protest, or some might call it illegal assembly. In the past, if people were found to be in violation of the law for such forms of protest, they might get some kind of community service punishment. But in the last year or more, we've seen prison sentences ranging from a few months to, in the case of Edward Leung, a sentence of 6 years, which is incredibly harsh. So I think that's probably the most serious area.
Mm-hmm. So final question: what do you think about the one country system? You think that could referring to what is happening in Hong Kong, that kind of will have affect the Taiwan.
Yes, I think one country, two systems, at least in part, was originally designed as a model to try to appeal to Taiwan.
Right.
But clearly, the way that it has been eroded in Hong Kong, it is not at all appealing for Taiwan. So I would think that it makes the possibility of any kind of unification with Taiwan, at least any kind of voluntary unification, even more unlikely, because Taiwan must be looking at the broken promises in Hong Kong and not wish to go in that direction.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How you sell that in England, we've had a lot of trouble selling that in the U.S. because of their tremendous economic influence and power. And I remember when President Xi was here, I thought it was bad enough. They tried the tendency, I assume there too, despite your group, to say, yeah, human rights are important, but we really have to focus on our national interest, economic and security interest.
Thank you very much. The first is, I think, and we are beginning to have conversations with business people around this issue. And of course, we can't expect business people to suddenly become human rights activists. So of course we need to make the argument to them in terms that they will relate to. And so I think the two areas where there may be just the beginnings of a discussion with business. One is around the rule of law, because I think it's undoubtedly in the interest of business for there to be a strong rule of law, strong independence of the judiciary. The other is around concerns about the potential implementation of Article 23, the anti-subversion law, the national security law in Hong Kong. We've actually just today published a report which is available on our website.
Some of the other issues.
Yes, thank you. And this, of course, relates to the question of human rights in China as a whole, including, but not limited to, Hong Kong. Again, one thought, perhaps illustrated in a couple of ways. I think that there is a real myth out there that in order to do trade and business with China, you have to kowtow to them and be silent on human rights. The reason I think that's a myth is that there's one world leader who has kind of broken the mold. I mean, my government, at least until recently, they're becoming a little bit more robust now, but at least until recently has followed that path of being fairly quiet on human rights issues in the name of trying to do trade. One world leader who hasn't done that is Angela Merkel. She has consistently spoken out on human rights in China, on all of her visits to China. She's sometimes met dissidents, spoken out, and yet Germany remains China's biggest trading partner in Europe. I actually wrote an article about this in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago, saying basically that you don't have to do trade, you don't have to kowtow, you can do what Angela Merkel's done. The other illustration I just want to mention is that I remember when you referred to Xi Jinping's visit to the UK at the end of 2015, and I entirely agree that I was very critical of my government at the time, that they rolled out the red carpet and they were silent on human rights. And I'll never forget an American businessman who was living in Shanghai and had lived in Shanghai for many years doing business in China. And he was interviewed on BBC. And he was very critical of the British government because he said that ultimately the Chinese actually respect you more when you stand up for your values and for what you as a country believe in, and that they lose respect for you when you kind of kowtow and surrender your values. And he said this expression which has stayed with me ever since. He said, if you act like a panting puppy, China will think that they have you on a leash, whereas if you stand tall, you do business with them, but you stand up for what you believe in, actually in the long run they'll respect you more. Chris Patten, the former governor of Hong Kong, similarly has said, China will do business, at the end of the day, China will do business with you if you have goods or services they want to buy. If they knew what was happening in Hong Kong, I think they would feel, because of the history, that Britain has a responsibility and an obligation to do something. I think the problem is that the vast majority of people don't know, and it's one of the purposes for Hong Kong Watch and one of our tasks is to make sure people are educated. The general public, members of Parliament, the media, and I hope we can continue to do that. Just in terms of the British government, I want to perhaps conclude on a slightly more hopeful note. I think the British government, until maybe a year or so ago, was shockingly weak on Hong Kong, and Chris Patten, the former governor, spoke out many times describing the 6 monthly reports that the British government published as anodyne and weak. There has been a change in the last year. I think that's partly because of the situation, in response to the situation, But I think also the current Foreign Secretary has been noticeably robust. So 3 examples of things he's done. Firstly, this relates to China more than Hong Kong, but on his first visit to Beijing, within a couple of weeks of becoming Foreign Secretary, he met with the wives of some of the human rights lawyers in China who've disappeared, which is, I mean, I would like to see foreign ministers do that all the time, but by comparison with standard practice, that's quite a bold move on your first visit. Secondly, the most recent 6-monthly report is much more, on Hong Kong, is much more robust, and his own forward to the report is very strong. And thirdly, in response to Victor Malit's case, the Financial Times journalist who was expelled from Hong Kong, the Foreign Secretary issued a very strong statement. Really, by Foreign Office standards, it was remarkably robust. So I hope those are indications that where the United Kingdom is taking a stronger position. I think his speech last night about developing a chain of democracies to defend these values in an era where around the world, not just in China, democracy and human rights are under increasing threat, is a very welcome speech. But of course, speeches and statements are only the first step, and I hope that he will then, and the government itself will then act on those statements. So we have more work to do, but I think we've come at an important time, and I hope we can begin to shift things in a better direction.
Thank you. I really cannot thank you enough.